History does not always move with the stroke of a pen. Sometimes it shifts with the roar of water. In the heart of East Africa, Ethiopia has completed the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a colossal structure of concrete and steel that now towers over the Blue Nile. $4 billion, 14 years, and the sweat of an entire nation have converged into a single moment. Africa has witnessed history being written not with ink, but with power, enough to light millions of homes. Yet this is not only about electricity, it is about dignity. For Ethiopia, the dam was never simply an engineering blueprint. It was a battle for self-reliance, a defiance against doubt, and a refusal to remain bound by the limits others imposed. Egypt and Sudan have looked on with unease, fearing for the waters that sustain them. But Ethiopia has stood firm, turning adversity into ambition. What does this mean for Africa's future? Is this dam a singular achievement or the spark of a continental awakening? Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching. The story of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam did not begin with concrete mixers or steel turbines. It began with a vision, a dream that seemed far too vast for a nation still wrestling with poverty and instability. In April 2011, as the world looked elsewhere, Ethiopia laid the first stone on the banks of the Blue Nile in the remote region of Benishangul Gumuz. Few outside the country believed the dream would survive its infancy. $4 billion was the price tag, a figure so daunting that many international observers dismissed it as fantasy. But Ethiopia was determined to prove them wrong. This was not a project financed by the checkbooks of foreign banks. It was built on the pockets and pride of Ethiopians themselves. Teachers donated part of their monthly wages. Farmers living hand-to-mouth still found a way to contribute. Members of the diaspora sent money home, not as charity but as solidarity. Civil servants bought government bonds, not for profit but for duty. Every brick, every bolt of steel carried with it the fingerprints of ordinary people who refused to be left in the dark. The dam was not just an engineering challenge. It was a national movement, a social covenant that bound together a fractured country with one shared mission: to stand tall. Technically, the task was immense. A wall of concrete rising 145 meters high, stretching 1.8 kilometers across the mighty river. Behind it, a reservoir capable of holding 74 billion cubic meters of water, creating one of the largest artificial lakes in Africa. On its crest stood 11 turbines, each a giant capable of producing almost 600 megawatts of electricity. Together, they promised 6,450 megawatts, more than doubling Ethiopia's existing energy capacity. The sheer logistics were overwhelming. Roads had to be carved out of unforgiving terrain. Heavy machinery had to be imported across hundreds of kilometers. Engineers trained on the job, learning skills never before practiced in Ethiopia. Many nights were lit not by electricity, but by the dim glow of kerosene lamps in worker camps, where men and women endured isolation, searing heat, and exhausting shifts. Yet in these hardships, a new generation of Ethiopian engineers was born, men and women who cut their teeth on Africa's largest hydroelectric project. The significance of this cannot be overstated. In a continent where most megaprojects are conceived, funded, and built by outsiders, Ethiopia's choice was radical. By shouldering the cost itself, it avoided the chains of debt that have bound so many African nations. By insisting on local participation, it created homegrown expertise. By refusing to abandon the project despite doubt and difficulty, it turned a fragile dream into an enduring monument of sovereignty. When the first turbines roared to life, the symbolism was as powerful as the electricity itself. Villages that had known only candlelight were suddenly illuminated. Factories no longer ground to a halt for lack of power. Hospitals could run equipment around the clock. For the first time in its modern history, Ethiopia saw the possibility of exporting energy to its neighbors. Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti. The Nile, once seen only as a source of contention, had become a source of promise. But beneath this triumph lay deeper questions. Could Ethiopia's gamble really pay off without igniting regional conflict? Would the sacrifices of displaced communities, who had to leave their ancestral lands to make way for the reservoir, be honored? Could the flow of the Nile, lifeline of Egypt, be controlled without plunging the region into turmoil? The dam stood complete, majestic and defiant. Yet it was clear, the story of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was not finished. It was only the beginning. The turbines may have conquered the river, but could they withstand the storm of politics waiting downstream? As the concrete rose and the turbines began to hum, another current swelled, not of water, but of politics. The Blue Nile had long been more than a river. It was a lifeline, a thread that bound nations in dependence and fear. And now, with Ethiopia's dam towering above its banks, that thread was being pulled tighter than ever before. In Cairo, the reaction was visceral. For Egypt, the Nile is not a resource to be negotiated. It is existence itself, the artery through which over 90% of its fresh water flows. Generations of farmers had plowed its fertile banks, generations of families had drunk from its flow, and generations of rulers had defended its control with unyielding conviction. To them, Ethiopia's new dam was not a triumph of engineering, but a challenge to survival. The rhetoric from Egyptian officials grew sharper with each stage of construction. Demands for legally binding guarantees filled the air. How fast would Ethiopia fill its massive reservoir? How much water would always be allowed to flow downstream? These were not technical details to Cairo. They were existential red lines. And when diplomacy stumbled, the whispers turned darker. Military options were discussed in hushed tones. Headlines warned of water wars. The notion that the flow of the Nile might one day be determined in Addis Ababa rather than Cairo unsettled the Egyptian psyche like little else. Sudan's position was far more tangled. On one hand, the promise of cheaper electricity in a stabilized river offered immense appeal. No more devastating floods sweeping away villages. No more crushing blackouts in Khartoum's hospitals. Yet the fear remained that sudden releases from Ethiopia's reservoir could overwhelm Sudan's own dams and irrigation systems. The result was ambivalence, a policy of shifting sands, sometimes siding with Egypt, sometimes leaning towards Ethiopia, never fully at ease with either. Inside Ethiopia, the picture was entirely different. The dam became a beacon of national pride, proof that a country often dismissed as fragile had achieved what many said was impossible. Streets filled with celebration as the turbines first spun. Leaders declared it a project of peace, promising that the Nile's flow would not be diminished, but made steadier, more reliable. The government framed the dam not as a weapon, but as a gift, a stabilizer against drought, a shield against floods, a source of light for millions. But beyond Ethiopia's borders, suspicion lingered. International media seized on the tension, painting the project as a powder keg waiting to ignite. The dam was compared to other flashpoints around the world: the Tigris and Euphrates, the Mekong, the Jordan, rivers that had turned into battlegrounds when upstream ambition clashed with downstream need. American and European diplomats stepped forward with cautious language, urging restraint, compromise, cooperation. The African Union attempted to mediate, convening summits that ended with little more than polite communiques. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to restore. Yet Ethiopia did not retreat. Officials insisted the project was about dignity, not domination. They reminded the world that no colonial-era treaty had ever recognized Ethiopia's rights to the Nile, even though the river's very source lay in its highlands. For Ethiopians, finishing the dam was not only about electricity, it was about reclaiming a voice that history had long denied them. This defiance electrified many across Africa. In Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya, commentators praised Ethiopia's resolve. At last, they said, an African nation had refused dependency and built something monumental with its own resources. At last, the narrative of aid and loans was being replaced with one of self-reliance and sacrifice. But the sacrifices were real, and they were heavy. Thousands of families had been uprooted from ancestral villages to make way for the rising reservoir. Promises of compensation often fell short. Farmers lost fertile soil, communities lost their heritage, workers toiled for years in harsh, isolated camps under a punishing sun. The triumph came at a price that could not always be measured in money. Still, for many Ethiopians, the pain was worth it. The dam was theirs, not the product of a foreign corporation, not the legacy of colonial negotiation, but a monument raised by the hands and pockets of ordinary citizens. That sense of ownership carried a power all its own. As the turbines spun, so too did the wheels of diplomacy, suspicion, and pride. Ethiopia had changed the river's flow, and with it, the flow of power in the region. The question now was not whether the dam would light villages and factories. That much was already happening. The question was whether it could withstand the weight of suspicion, the strain of mistrust, and the storm of geopolitics that swirled all around it. The Nile's waters had been harnessed, but the currents of diplomacy were only beginning to surge. and no one knew where they might break. The completion of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was more than an announcement of megawatts. It was the beginning of a transformation that touched households, industries, and the fragile threads of politics alike. When the first waves of electricity surged into Ethiopia's grid, villages that had lived for generations in candlelight were suddenly bathed in brightness. Children could study after sunset. Farmers could irrigate fields with electric pumps instead of waiting for rains. Clinics, once crippled by unreliable generators, kept life-saving machines running without interruption. For urban Ethiopia, the dam meant factories freed from the tyranny of blackouts. Textile mills, cement plants, steel workshops, once throttled by sporadic power cuts, now pulsed with renewed rhythm. The cost of energy dropped, production soared, and confidence grew. With surplus electricity on the horizon, Ethiopia positioned itself not merely as a consumer, but as an exporter. Deals were already being drawn with Kenya, Djibouti, and Sudan to buy power. Electricity was no longer just a domestic asset, it was a currency of influence. Yet beneath this progress lay difficult human realities. The reservoir had swallowed entire landscapes. Communities that had tilled the same soil for centuries were forced to leave ancestral villages. Some were relocated to new settlements with promises of compensation, but for many the move was disorienting, cutting them off from traditions, livelihoods, and sacred spaces. Critics accused the government of prioritizing steel over souls, pointing to inadequate support for displaced families. The social cost of GERD became a silent undercurrent in the narrative of national triumph. Politically, the dam became a double-edged sword. On one side, it unified a fractured nation around a shared achievement. Ethnic divisions and political rivalries briefly gave way to collective pride. For a people often portrayed as divided, GERD was proof of unity. But on the other side, the project became a lightning rod in domestic politics. Successive governments used the dam as a symbol of legitimacy, claiming ownership of the achievement while deflecting criticism of internal unrest. Opposition voices accused leaders of exploiting GERD to silence dissent, of turning a people's project into a political shield. This tension between national pride and political manipulation mirrored a wider pattern across Africa. Large projects often became more than infrastructure. They became battlegrounds of legitimacy. Ethiopia was not alone in this. In West Africa, Burkina Faso's story offered a parallel. After the Ibrahim Traoré coup, conversations shifted from aid dependency to national sovereignty. Just as Ethiopians saw GERD as proof that they could build without foreign control, many in Burkina Faso looked to Traoré's rise as evidence that Africa could reclaim political agency, rejecting structures imposed by external powers. Both Ethiopia and Burkina Faso, though different in context, fed into a shared continental awakening. The dam was concrete, turbines, and water. The coup was politics, security, and ideology, but both were animated by the same spirit, a refusal to be dictated to, a demand for dignity on African terms. It was this resonance that made GERD's significance spill beyond its walls, shaping narratives of sovereignty from the Horn of Africa to the Sahel. Inside Ethiopia, the stakes remained high. While the turbines promised prosperity, the costs of construction had strained public finances. Years of diverting funds, of rallying citizens to buy bonds and donate wages, left scars of sacrifice. Some families struggled under the weight of contributions that cut into their meager incomes. Yet even in hardship, many clung to the pride of having built the dam with our own hands. The psychological dividend, the sense of ownership, often outweighed the economic pain. Still, the question lingered. Would the benefits truly trickle down? Would rural households see affordable electricity? Or would industries and export contracts consume the lion's share? Would displaced families receive the justice they were promised? These questions festered beneath the celebration, demanding answers that power alone could not provide. And in the background, Ethiopia's fragile political landscape continued to tremble. Protests flared over governance, ethnic tensions remained volatile, and critics warned that GERD's triumph could mask deeper fractures. If the dam became a unifying symbol, it could also become a scapegoat should promises of prosperity falter. Ethiopia had lit the night, but could it keep the lights of unity and justice burning? Or would the glow of the dam cast shadows too dark to ignore? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was never just a domestic story. From the moment its foundations were laid, it became a theater for international diplomacy. Water, after all, does not respect borders, and power generated on one bank of the Nile reverberates across entire regions. The African Union tried repeatedly to mediate between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. Summits in Addis Ababa, Khartoum, and Johannesburg convened with urgency, yet trust proved elusive. Egypt demanded legally binding guarantees. Ethiopia resisted, framing such demands as infringements on sovereignty. Sudan wavered, sometimes leaning towards Cairo, sometimes towards Addis Ababa. The AU's call for African solutions to African problems became both an aspiration and a test. Regional blocs, too, watched closely. The East African community eyed the dam as a potential anchor for energy integration. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development saw in it a tool for stability, but also a trigger for potential conflict. Across the Red Sea, Arab states worried about water security and food imports tied to Nile agriculture. Western powers, led by the United States and the European Union, urged compromise. Official statements cloaked in diplomatic language emphasized cooperation and shared prosperity, yet beneath the surface lay strategic concerns. Washington feared that unresolved disputes could destabilize a region already strained by conflict. European capitals worried about migration and security flows should instability spread. China, though less vocal, had its own stake as a rising investor in African infrastructure, wary of seeing instability undermine long-term interests. But the most profound reactions came not from chancelleries abroad, but from within Africa itself. For many Africans, GERD became a symbol that the continent could build and finance its own destiny. Commentators in Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana hailed the project as proof that Africa need not always bow to international lenders. Editorials spoke of a turning tide, of a future where African states seize control of their resources and redefine their place in the global order. In this sense, GERD resonated far beyond the Nile Basin. Its symbolism touched conversations in the Sahel, where new leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso spoke of independence not as rhetoric, but as policy. Just as Ethiopia rejected foreign dictates in building its dam, Burkina Faso pursued food and industrial self-sufficiency under the banner of the Burkina Faso Revolution. Both cases, though different in context, fed into the same narrative, that Africa's path to sovereignty would not be handed down from abroad, but constructed within. For global observers, the question was not only whether GERD would spark conflict, but whether it would embolden a new wave of African ambition. If one nation could defy the odds and rewrite the balance of power in its region, what would stop others from doing the same? The turbines now spun with continental significance, but the greater question remained. Was this dam a singular triumph or the prelude to a broader African awakening? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam now stands complete, but its story is still being written. For Ethiopia, the dam represents not an ending, but a beginning, a gateway into an uncertain but promising future. The turbines hum, sending power across the nation and soon across borders, yet the full measure of GERD's legacy will be tested in the years to come. The opportunities are immense. Ethiopia has the potential to become the energy hub of East Africa, exporting electricity to Sudan, Kenya, and Djibouti. Power lines stretching from Addis Ababa could become arteries of trade and integration, binding the region not only through wires but through shared prosperity. Lower energy costs may attract industries, creating jobs, boosting exports, and lifting millions out of poverty. With renewable energy at its core, Ethiopia could also claim a moral voice in the global climate debate, presenting itself as a model of green development on the African continent. But every opportunity carries shadowed risks. Managing the reservoir responsibly will require delicate diplomacy with Egypt and Sudan. Missteps could inflame tensions, fueling regional instability. Internally, Ethiopia must ensure that the benefits of the dam reach ordinary citizens, that rural villages receive affordable electricity, that displaced families are not forgotten, that the project's human cost is not buried beneath its concrete walls. Failing to deliver equity could turn a symbol of unity into a source of grievance. Beyond Ethiopia, GERD's future will be judged by its role in continental transformation. Will it inspire a generation of African leaders to take ownership of their resources? Or will it remain an exceptional story overshadowed by disputes? Its symbolism already resonates across the continent. Just as Burkina Faso's new policies of self-reliance seek to rewrite dependency in the Sahel, GERD calls for a reimagining of sovereignty in the Horn of Africa. Together, these movements hint at a shared continental rhythm, the sound of Africa choosing its own course. The road ahead is not free of obstacles. Environmental concerns linger: sediment flow, ecosystem disruption, evaporation. Political challenges endure. fragile governance in Ethiopia, strained relations with neighbors, global pressures. But history has always been shaped by those willing to carry burdens heavier than themselves. For Ethiopia, the dam is such a burden and such an opportunity. The Nile has carried civilizations for thousands of years. Today, it carries the weight of a new dream, that Africa can rise not by waiting for external benevolence, but by building with its own hands. GERD is a bridge to that dream. The waters are contained, the turbines are spinning, but the greater current has only just begun. Will Africa ride this wave into sovereignty, or will the tide pull it back into dependence once more? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is more than a wall of concrete holding back the Nile. It is a declaration that Africa can imagine, finance, and build its own destiny. For Ethiopia, the dam is proof that self-reliance is not a slogan, but a living reality, written into the hum of turbines and the glow of electricity across villages and cities. For Africa, it is a symbol that sovereignty is not granted from abroad, but claimed from within. The journey was not easy. 14 years of struggle, billions of dollars raised not from foreign lenders, but from the sacrifices of citizens. Communities were relocated, families gave up wages, workers endured harsh conditions. Yet through these sacrifices, Ethiopia emerged with a monument that belongs not to a government or a corporation, but to its people. The dam embodies both the burden and the beauty of self-determination. But GERD does not stand alone. Across the continent, movements of sovereignty are taking root. In the Sahel, the Ibrahim Traoré coup in Burkina Faso shifted the political narrative, challenging decades of dependency and calling for African solutions to African challenges. In policy and rhetoric alike, Traoré's government echoes the same principle that built GERD, that dignity comes from ownership, not from aid. Together, these stories form a chorus of ambition, voices declaring that Africa's future will not be dictated, but designed. The parallels are striking. GERD reshapes the flow of energy in East Africa. The Burkina Faso Revolution reshapes the flow of power in West Africa. Both signal a rejection of old constraints and a step towards a horizon where African nations determine their own path. The challenge ahead is not whether these movements will face resistance. They will. The question is whether Africa will endure, adapt, and grow stronger under pressure. GERD's turbines may be rooted in Ethiopia, but its message belongs to the continent. Sovereignty is possible, but it must be defended with courage. In the end, the story of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the story of the Ibrahim Traoré coup converge on a single truth. Africa is no longer content to be shaped from the outside. It is shaping itself, one river, one policy, one revolution at a time. Do not look away. If this resonates with your sense of justice, subscribe and walk with us into Africa's new dawn.